Okay, hello everybody. I am working on Chapter 8, the muscular system. And let's just look at the overview of what you'll be expected to know. So we will be looking at the three different types of muscle tissue. And then in terms of the muscular system, you will need to know the muscular structure as well as the muscle cells in action. In terms of the muscle mechanics, you will need to just be responsible for the definitions of the attachments for the origin and the insertion. As far as some of these other things, the energy sources, the effects of exercise, types of contractions, aging and disorder, I am going to omit that. You will be responsible for knowing some of the muscle groups, not all of them, and I will go over those. Here are some key terms. And if we look at the learning objectives, you will be responsible for comparing the three different types of muscle tissue, which I'll go over in a moment, describing the functions of the skeletal muscle, and then the structure of skeletal muscle down to the individual cells. I will have some animations that are up in regard to this under Chapter 8 that you can look at. You will be responsible as well for outlining the steps in a muscle contraction, and I will go over that, and then you will also have an animation which will help hopefully assist in your understanding. You will need to know the compounds that are stored in the muscle to generate energy. 6, 7, and 8 you are not responsible for. You will not be responsible for how the muscles work together, nor comparing the workings of those muscles in terms of a lever system. You will be responsible for naming some of the major muscle groups and their locations, and function is not necessarily something that I'm concentrating on. So, and I think that that's it for the items that you will be responsible for. So if we look at the three different types of muscles, we have smooth muscle, cardiac, and skeletal. And if you note at the diagrams or the pictures there, those drawings, they are very different in terms of the way that they look. Smooth muscle makes up the walls of your hollow body or organs, as well as your blood vessels and your respiratory passageways. It contracts and produces a wave-like motion, such as in peristalsis, which is the movement of like food down through your esophagus. It is an involuntary muscle. We also have it lining some of our hollow organs, such as the uterus, and they're tapered at each end. They have a single central nucleus, and they do have striations. The cardiac muscle is, of course, found in the wall of the heart, and it is an involuntary muscle. We don't need to think about our heart contracting. And so it creates this pulsing action for the heart. They're striated, just like with the skeletal muscle, but they differ in terms of the number of nuclei. They only have one. So the cardiac muscle only has one nucleus per cell. And however, as you can note in this in this diagram, it does have branching, which the skeletal muscle does not. So even though they are striated, they don't have that branching. They only have one nucleus, where there are many nuclei in the skeletal muscle. So if you look at this, if you look at the skeletal muscle, of course, that's going to be attached to your bones. It's multinucleated, and it's heavily striated, and it's voluntary. So those are some of the distinctions there. So you should be able to identify the three different types of muscles at this point. So which muscle is striated and involuntary? So that would be cardiac. And then moving on, what are the three functions of the skeletal muscle? And looking at the structure of the skeletal muscle down to the individual cells is another objective that we'll cover here. And then also the steps in a muscle contraction. Most of this chapter 8 pertains to skeletal muscles. So from here on out, that's what we'll be discussing. So you will be responsible for listing the compounds that are stored within the muscle cells and what happens. But in terms of 6, 7, and 8, you are not responsible for those. So skeletal muscle has 3 primary functions, and those are for, of course, for moving our skeleton. Those muscles are attached to bones, and they contract to change the position of our bones at a joint, and then, of course, to maintain our posture. So we need some partial muscle contractions in order to provide us some muscle tone and to keep the body in an erect position. And then also our muscles are responsible for generating heat. So when we get cold, our muscles heat up our system by boosting the energy output and having a shivering reaction. In terms of the structure of a muscle, fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers that make up the whole muscle. At this point, this probably makes absolutely no sense, but I'll show you with the diagram all of these terms and where they are and what they're related to. So of course, the fascicles have to be holding or be held together, and there are 3 layers. And what you can think of is those 3 layers are here, and they are bundles. So starting from the innermost, okay, bundle, we have a muscle fiber, this is a cell. It has a covering around it, and it's known as the endomysium. You have a bunch of these together. So think of these like a bunch of pencils. And so you are holding a group of pencils, and each one of them has a covering that's called the endomysium. When that group of pencils are all gathered together in your hand, those are bundled into what we call the perimysium. That's their covering. And that whole system of muscle fiber cells that are being encased in the perimysium is known as a muscle fascicle. Then we have a bunch of fascicles, one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other, and which are all being bound by that covering of tissue known as the perimysium. And those bundled together are covered by what we call the epimysium. All of that, it makes up the body of the muscle, and that muscle then, the epimysium, is then continuous down to the tendon, which attaches to the bone. So I hope that makes more sense to you. So it's just like a bunch of bundles. So you have down at the smallest level, we have one muscle fiber, which is considered to be a cell. It is encased in a connective tissue that is known as the endomysium. We get a bunch of those muscle fibers encased in a tissue known as the perimysium. Then we get and that's a muscle fascicle. We get a bunch of those fascicles all bundled together and encased with this tissue that's known as the epimysium, which is continuous with the tendon that is attached to the bone. So when we look at muscles in action, that means that how are muscles contracting? Well, in order for a muscle to contract, it has to be stimulated, and it's stimulated through neurons that are interconnecting with the muscle fibers, and when that happens, we have a contraction. There are two different types of motor units, either a small motor unit, which will govern our fine movements like our eye, or large motor units, which are like walking, okay? But all of those are controlled through the central nervous system, which sends out a stimulus to the muscle. And so those are what consists of a motor unit. So when we look at this, there are junctions between the neuron, okay, of the nervous system and the muscle. And we call that the neuromuscular junction. So it's where those nerve fibers are connecting with a muscle fiber. And remember that this is down to the cellular level. So the muscles are actually at a fiber, which is a cell. And where those two junctures meet is known as a synapse. So if we look at the neuromuscular junction anatomy, we have to have a neuron, specifically one that is involved in stimulating the muscle, so it's a motor neuron. Then we have to have a means by which it communicates from the neuron to the muscle fiber or the cell, and that is known as a neurotransmitter, and specifically that neurotransmitter that's being released from the neuron, from the nerve cell, is known as acetylcholine, and its abbreviation is capital A, capital CH. Then on the other side, we have the muscle fiber. So you have your neuron on one side, then you have your muscle fiber on the other side, and they are communicating back and forth through this chemical, which is known as a neurotransmitter, that's known as acetylcholine. And so that motor end plate, which is on the muscle side, has some receptors for that acetylcholine chemical to make it have the stimulus occur and for the muscle to begin contracting. So these are all of the events that occur here, and it causes a action potential which makes the muscle contract. So let's look at this in terms of a diagram, which will make more sense. And as I said, I am going to put up and it's already up, a animation that will help to show the sequence of events and how all of this, these chemicals are causing the contraction of the muscle cells. So what we have here on this end, this is a motor neuron. So it is a nerve cell. and the nerve cell itself is connecting with the muscle. And this is one muscle cell. So if you note, there's a lot of little circles in here, and they represent the vesicles that are carrying some very key components to make a muscle contract. If you look here, you have this area that looks like it's, just shaded in blue. And that's the junction, the neuromuscular junction between the neuron here, the tip of the neuron. So this is this here and being expanded. It looks like all of this. And this is a cell. So it has some vesicles in it, in that neuron. It also has some mitochondria, because it needs to have energy in order to provide all of the substances and to release them. So here in this space between the neuron on this side and then the muscle on this side, so what we're looking at, the neuron here on this side with the 1, 2, 3 little grooves, and then the muscle on this side is this here, neuron and muscle. So if you note and if you remember back, I think it was in chapter 3 where we talked about exocytosis. Well, these vesicles have the substances that are necessary for starting a muscle contraction. And these vesicles have that chemical which is known as acetylcholine. And the acetylcholine is being deposited by exocytosis, where the vesicle fuses with the plasma membrane of the neuron and then releases the substance, which is the acetylcholine, into this space, and we call this space the synaptic cleft. And then the receptors that are embedded in the plasma membrane of the muscle cell or muscle fiber are interlocking with those chemicals, the acetylcholine, and then that institutes and begins a action potential, which starts a muscle contraction. So here, you see here, this is a skeletal muscle fiber cell. This is a neuron. And these here on the ends are all of these branches of the neurons, which have the acetylcholine inside of them, inside the vesicles. In the space, they release that acetylcholine between the muscle and the neuron itself, and then the receptors on the muscle pick up that acetylcholine, and it will begin to initiate a contraction. Okay, so when we move on, when we look at a contraction, it only takes place where it takes place all along the muscle fiber, but it propagates like a electrical impulse. So it starts in one location, which we call a sarcomere, and then it is propagating along that muscle fiber to make the rest of the muscle fiber contract. There are 2 different parts to a muscle cell, and their muscles themselves are only made up of some proteins, and those proteins are either a thick filament or a thin filament. The thick filament is myosin, the thin filament is actin. There are some other proteins that come into play here that are responsible for the contraction to take place, and those are troponin and tropomyosin. Those are associated with the actin. So let me show you here. So when we look at this, remember that the myosin were the thick filaments, so they're darker here. And then the thin filaments here are the actin. All right, and that is making up a muscle fascicle. See here, that's all being wrapped around. And then we have all of the individual muscle fibers that are within it. So what happens is that the muscle doesn't actually get any shorter. It just contracts. So envision like one sliding over the other. And the one has teeth. The myosin has teeth like a comb. And it's going to lock into the actin and make it slide over each other. Of course, we need some energy for that to take place, and that's in the form of ATP. So this is what happens. So this is one motor unit that's known as a sarcomere. We have the actin, which is in red, and that's the thin filament. We have the myosin, which is in blue, and remember I said that they have like little teeth on it, and they grab a hold of the actin. And then what happens is that these little teeth heads on the myosin actually act like oars, and they kind of push along. And when they push along, they push and push and push, and they pull these actin proteins closer together. So the contraction occurs towards the center of that sarcomere. And then, but what happens here is kind of unique, because we have times that we don't need our skeletal muscles to be contracting. Well, at that point, they're covered up, and they're covered up by these things called troponin. So this is a actin. All of this orange is actin, and these rope-like things are tropomyosin. On the outside of that tropomyosin are these little tiny other proteins that are called troponin. Well, ordinarily, the myosin little oars do not enter are blocked by the troponin, and they cannot latch on to the actin. So this myosin oar can't lock on to the actin and push it along to make the actin begin to shorten, not necessarily shorten, but move to contract. So what happens is that we've got to move this away so that these myosin heads, oars, can interact with the actin. And what does that is calcium. And calcium is actually being released from the neuron, and it's stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum of the neuron. And that's a fancy name for the endoplasmic reticulum of every other cell. They just call it a sarcoplasmic reticulum in a muscle cell. Okay, so the calcium gets released, and then when it does, it latches onto these three little troponins, and it moves them out of the way. So now you can see that the oar can actually bind to the actin, okay? And this, again, the calcium is actually pulling. If you note here, the troponin is right on top of the tropomyosin. The tropomyosin is in contact with the actin. Well, the actin, little balls, have to interact with these myosin heads. Well, if this tropomyosin rope is in the way and the troponin is in the way, then we need to get it moved, and the calcium does the moving. So the calcium creates this space here and it latches on to the troponin, pulls the tropomyosin rope up, that the myosin head can now attach to the binding sites of the actin. And then it does its little action of moving like an oar, like a sweeping motion in and in. And so as a result of that, it's going to cause it to contract. Okay, so these are just a summary of all of the events that occur and in sequence. So the first thing that has to happen is the acetylcholine, this ACH, has to be released from the neuron into that synaptic cleft, which is between the neuron and the muscle itself. Then that acetylcholine is going to bind to those protein receptors that are located along the muscle cell, and that section where they do bind is known as the motor end plate. So, so if you look at this, let me go back here. Oops. Okay, so if you look at this, this is your neuron. This is your synaptic cleft. This side over here where the muscle is known as the motor end plate. So that's, sorry. So the acetylcholine binds to the motor end plate. That's where the muscle is, and it starts to produce this thing called an action potential, which is really the propagation of a nerve impulse down that muscle fiber to make it contract. So then the action potential travels to what they call the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And that's what is releasing the calcium into the cytoplasm. And then that calcium shifts the troponin and the tropomyosin off of the thin filaments so that they can bind. And that sarcoplasmic reticulum containing the calcium is in the muscle cell, in the muscle fiber. So hopefully that makes good sense. And as I said, I will go back and have the and you can view the animation of all of this. And then again, that myosin head, that's like the little oar, will be able to bind to the thinner actin, and it forms the cross bridges, and then it pulls those filaments together so that it shortens, and then the ATP is going to go in and cause the release of those myosin oar heads from the actin, and then the muscle will relax at that point. And then the calcium actually is reabsorbed into the sarcoplasmic reticulum of the muscle cell. Okay, so a single neuron in all the muscle fibers, it stimulates, would be a motor unit. Let's say a single neuron in all the muscle fibers, it stimulates. Okay, comprise a motor end plate. All right. Yes, because that's where it is on the muscle cell. I was thinking of like the whole unit of the sarcomere. Sorry about that. Okay, the two filaments that form a cross bridge are the actin and myosin. And then, of course, when we look at the muscle contraction, it has to be supplied by some source of energy, and that's in the form of ATP. Skeletal muscles are producing ATP through aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen in order to produce the glucose. When the oxygen has been depleted, then it goes into anaerobic respiration that doesn't make as much glucose. And some of the storage places for the supply of oxygen and glucose is in the form of myoglobin. It's just like hemoglobin that's found in our red blood cells, but it's myoglobin, which is found in our muscle cells. And then, of course, glycogen is a big, huge sugar molecule that breaks down into smaller units of glucose. And those are what are used for the generation of the energy molecule of ATP. Okay, we're not going to go through this. Nothing on exercises or the types of muscle contractions. And which muscle cell compound stores oxygen. And so, of course, that would be myoglobin. And then we're not worried about how our muscles work or the lever system. You do need to know that that muscles attach to bones via tendons. There are two different areas where the muscle attaches. The origin is the fixed point, and the insertion is where it moves. So if we look here, the origin would be for these muscles would be at the fixed spot at the shoulder, and then the insertion where it's moving would be at our elbow. We're not worried about this. I'm not worried about this, nor this. Not worried about that. Okay, now we're going to look at, and you will be responsible for large muscle group names, and to determine where they are. So you will have these same diagrams back, and what you need to know, and I'm going to go through this very slowly. You will need to know the orbicularis or oculi, which surrounds the eye. You will need to know the orbicularis oris, which is around our mouth. The temporalis, which is here on the side. Okay. And then the masseter, which is on the side of the cheek. Okay, that aids in our chewing. The sternocleidomastoid, which is in our neck, that it helps to aid in our nodding of our head like in a yes. The trapezius is this large sheet, and you can see it much better on the back, and it looks like a triangle. The deltoid, which is on the shoulder. And then the intercostals, which are here, which enable us to expand our rib cage. The external oblique, which are, do I have the external oblique on here? Yes, it is. There it is. The external oblique here, which is a large sheet. The rectus abdominis, which is underlying this, and it lies vertically, or rather horizontally, along the shaft of the body's abdomen. The biceps brachii, which you will find here on the arm. The brachioradialis, which is here on the lower arm. So biceps brachii and the brachioradialis. The sartorius. The sartorius is along the inside of the leg here. These are just the largest muscle groups. You will need to know the quadriceps femoris, which constitute 3 of them. You will not be responsible for their individual names. The gastrocnemius, which is our calf muscle. The extensor digitatum longus, which is here on the inside of our calf. Sorry. And I don't think it shows that one, so I'll delete that one. So you won't need to know that one. The fibularis longus, you will need to know it's on the lateral side of our calf. And the tibialis anterior, which is this one in the center, runs down our shin. Okay, so you have a total of 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 on the anterior diagram that you will need to identify for the exam. And then for the posterior, you will need to know 13. And those are the sternocleidomastoid, again, which is here in the neck. You will need to know the trapezius, which is like that triangular shaped muscle. The deltoid, which is in the arm, the upper arm that gives it its roundedness. The teres minor, which is under our shoulder here. The teres major, which is below that. The latissimus dorsi, and that's this big sheet here. That's the latissimus dorsi. The triceps brachii, which is on the back of the arm, upper arm. The gluteus maximus, which is our butt. The gastrocnemius again, which is our calf muscle. The fibularis longus, which is here on the outside of our calf along here. Okay. The fascia, and with the fascia, I just want you to know that we do have a fascia, which is like a sheet that is connecting the latissimus dorsi down the center of our back. The Achilles tendon, which is the longest tendon in the body, and then you will not need to know anything other than the hamstrings, which are on the back of the thigh. So that's it for this chapter. I'm not asking you to know any of the muscles in the forearm or the hand, nor of the those for respiration, nor for, now some of these are in the those that you need to know. None of these for the perineum. Okay. So that's about it. You're not responsible for aging and nor any of the muscular disorders. Okay. I hope that everybody has a nice day, and we'll continue along with Chapter 9 next. You will have an exam which will consist of, let's see, you'll have 8, 9, and 10 together on exam 3. All righty. Talk to you later. Have a nice day.